Looking to win more clients and win for more clients in the current and post NAR settlement era? Then you know that exceptional representation of your clients includes knowing how to appropriately collect compensation through the transaction in the form of a seller concession. In this video, I'm going to break down seller concessions relating to how they're utilized before navigating some of the wild cards you need to be aware of as a listing or selling agent. I'll conclude with some questions that will help you determine whether cooperating compensation offerings or seller concessions will be better for your buyer or seller transactions. My name is Daniel Moskowitz. I'm a 20-year South Carolina licensee and the broker in charge of Dunes Real Estate, serving the Hilton Head Island, Bluffton, and surrounding Lowcountry. And I'm excited to share my knowledge to elevate the experience and professionalism of our industry. Oh yeah, and if you didn't watch my last video on cooperating compensation, I suggest you watch that first, especially if you still believe the seller is responsible for paying it. So concept number one, a seller concession is a tool, not a compensation agreement. Seller concessions are another exceptional tool that, when used as a monetary concession, helps the seller maximize their sale price while creating a favorable position for a buyer with limited funds, or simply delivering the benefit of less out of pocket for buyers with funds. So how do we leverage a seller concession as a tool? Well, first scenario, more buyer cash. A seller offering concessions to cover buyer closing costs and prepaids can expand the market of buyers, especially first-time home buyers. By covering costs such as attorney's fees, title fees, and prepaids, like association fees or taxes, the seller enables the buyer to allocate more cash toward their mortgage down payment. This increased buying power makes the property more attractive and accessible by a larger market. In scenario two, the unforeseen solution, consider a scenario where a contract is renegotiated due to an unanticipated issue, like polybutylene plumbing. A seller concession might take the form of a price reduction or contribution towards buyer closing costs to cover repair expenses post-closing. While this approach must be handled carefully and with legal guidance, it can provide a practical solution to those unexpected problems. Then scenario three, seller concessions as buyer agent compensation. In this scenario, a buyer negotiates a seller concession to cover their obligations to compensate their buyer's agent, as established in their buyer representation agreement. This must be navigated with legal and ethical caution, making it essential to consult your broker in charge or legal counsel before doing so. Concept two, avoid unforced errors when correctly navigating seller concessions for funding of buyer agent compensation. Let's quickly navigate this the moment you arrive in the post-August 17th world of real estate with a client. So generally speaking, you've already, one, delivered the brokerage relationship disclosure brochure with a meaningful explanation of those relationships. You did this at your first substantive exchange and you've gotten it back. You have a buyer agent agreement in place, meaning you've established rapport, you've signed your terms of representation, which also established your compensation. So you may now physically and virtually tour them through a home. And you've presented inventory and clarified compensation, meaning prior to showing properties, you likely clarified to your purchaser what cooperating compensation amounts were offered and even ratified compensation agreements with some of those listing brokerages. You've found seller concessions marketed in some capacity, whether on or off the MLS, and you've investigated in further detail, or if specified, how much is being offered to a buyer. In the offer negotiation, if a property's listing brokerage's cooperative compensation doesn't cover your compensation, but a seller concession is advertised, work with your buyer to decide if some or all of that concession can bridge any shortfall in compensation owed. But remember, avoid the pitfalls. Compensation risks. Per the NAR settlement, if compensation is advertised in the MLS, remember that not all those funds may go toward buyer agent compensation. Avoid lending risks. If lending is involved, delineating what amount is applied toward buyer agent compensation can keep it from exceeding contribution limits. You see, FHA, VA, USDA, and conventional loans have limitations on what a purchaser may receive, and exceeding these limits can jeopardize the buyer's loan approval, causing potential deal disruptions. And for those using the Hilton Head Area Realtors contract, this will need to be added, as there's currently not a blank respective to the buyer agent portion of concessions, at least at this time. And C, be aware of tax consequences for the buyer or seller. How things are specified could potentially impact the cost basis of the property for capital gains impact. It's critical to consult your broker in charge and legal counsel when approaching these scenarios, and always encourage clients to seek the same. Concept 3, cooperating compensation versus seller concession. Which is better for the transaction? This question is highly subjective and depends on the unique circumstances of the buyer and seller. But here's some questions to consider for your sellers. Do you want more agents working to sell your property or fewer? Do you want more buyers who need funds to afford your property? Is it important to get the highest possible price for your home? Does your home need work you're unable or unwilling to pay for before closing? For buyers, do you want to maximize your cash available for a down payment? Are you prepared to negotiate seller concessions to cover your agent's compensation? Some key points to consider. 1, cooperating compensation. There are offers of straightforward incentive for buyer agents to bring clients to the table, and they expand your market reach. Seller concessions provide flexibility in negotiations, potentially covering buyer costs and enhancing their purchasing power. Ultimately, the best approach depends on the specific needs and goals of your clients. Seller concessions can be a versatile tool, but they require careful navigation and clear communication to ensure all parties understand their roles and obligations. In conclusion, here are a few key takeaways. Number 1, seller concessions are tools to maximize sale price and buyer accessibility. Number 2, navigating seller concessions for buyer's agent compensation requires careful legal and ethical consideration. And number 3, both cooperating compensation and seller concessions have their advantages. Depending on the transaction dynamics, you will decide which is best. Stay tuned for our next session, where we'll explore how Dunes Real Estate plans to communicate cooperative compensation offerings and facilitate compensation agreements to maintain an exceptional transactional experience for all parties involved. I'm Daniel Moskowitz, broker in charge at Dunes Real Estate, and committed to elevating real estate professionals.